Welcome everyone. We are so delighted that you join us for What Remains, Landscape and Method in Post-Quake Gyumri, talk with Evangeline McGlynn from the University of California, Berkeley. Let me introduce a little bit about ARISC. The American Research Institute of the South Caucasus is an American overseas research center, an independent not-for-profit that supports research in and about Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, both in the South Caucasus and the US. ARISC encourages and supports scholarly study of the South Caucasus states across all disciplines of the humanities, sciences, and social sciences. ARISC's mission is to promote and encourage American research in the region and to foster intellectual inquiry across boundaries within the South Caucasus, as well as between the South Caucasus and its neighbors. You can find more information about us and our future upcoming events and lectures in this summer that you might be interested in. I now have the pleasure to introduce Ms. McGlynn. Evangeline McGlynn is an ARISC Fellow and a PhD candidate at the University of Berkeley, where she is pursuing a PhD in geography with a secondary concentration in science and technology studies. Before starting in geography, Ms. McGlynn completed a master's in design at Harvard's Graduate School of Design, where she focused on landscape and violence. Previous to her graduate education, she worked professionally as a designer in the tech sector and a technical specialist in the humanitarian sphere, both of which color her work in geography, which is focused on disaster and critical spatial inquiry. Please join me a round of virtual applause to welcome Ms. McGlynn. Thank you. Now I pass the floor to Ms. Evangeline McGlynn. Please.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm famously bad at setting up presentations like this, so let me make sure that I've correctly shared my screen. Can we see it? What is happening? There we go. All right. So we can all see my first slide. I first want to thank Ani for so kindly introducing me. Once again, my name is Evangeline, and I'm here today to present some very preliminary thoughts on the urban landscape of Gyumri, Armenia, where I've been conducting work. For those of you not familiar with the city of Gyumri or the disaster, the earthquake I am about to describe, just a few words. The central event around which my research is based is an earthquake that happened in northern Armenia, then the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic, in 1988 on December 7th at 11:41. The disaster killed at least 25,000 people, the majority of whom resided in Gyumri, Armenia's second city. This was more than 30 years ago, but the recovery process is still very much at play and very much evident on the urban landscape. This talk is less about the quake itself, but rather some of the still remaining remnants of that disaster period. So in terms of the project itself, I've taken a three-pronged approach to try to get some broader portrait of this thing we call memory of this single traumatic event by triangulating between oral histories, that is spoken accounts of people who are alive now, the archive, in a broad sense of archive, of what was written down at the time, and also in an attempt to try to interrogate the city itself, been using these research walks, which will be the main focus of our discussion today. So rather than talk about the entire project, we're just going to be focusing on what we can learn from this one segment in hopes of having some interesting methodologically focused discussion. As I'm sure you can imagine, this has been a very strange time to conduct research. And I did not know when I wrote my initial proposal that this would be an ideal component for the months when the archives were closed and my university had banned in-person research. So for whatever reason, luck was on my side. And in continuing on and staying in Armenia throughout the entire pandemic and the war, I was able to do this component of my research. In terms of what research walking is, it's a lot of walking through the city and systematically mapping things. I wore through 2 pairs of shoes over the past year of research. But other than that, it's me with a camera phone and a notebook walking around and trying to measure specific objects and their occurrence throughout the city. So while it's evolved into something somewhat different, the initial inspiration for this way of reading the landscape came from the idea of transect mapping in architecture, where one analyzes the landscape through the barriers one hits in trying to get across. This has become a more systematic exercise because I had a lot more time than I expected, that has wrought some different results, I think. But in any case, coming back to the earthquake, in order to talk about what I was looking for while walking through the city, I have to keep myself from saying, just walking around. It sounds like I'm not doing something. I promise there's a systematic method involved. But in order to talk about what I was looking for while I was exploring the urban landscape, I think we need to lightly gloss over this idea of a stratigraphic landscape. This is taken a bit from Simon Schama, a specific view of cultural landscapes wherein we can conceive of the city as layers of its past lives. And beyond my love of a good geophysical metaphor, it happens to work very nicely for Gyumri, where some of the rubble from the earthquake was literally repurposed as fundament for later developed neighborhoods. So just, I promise you, this is the most text you're going to see in the talk. Everything else is fun pictures. But in order to get through this, I want to talk about a couple of objects and how they exist on the landscape and ways in which they might better illustrate this stratigraphic concept. So the first object that I'm going to talk about are fountains. So any foreigner to Armenia will tell you how immediately striking the prevalence of public water fountains are all over the country. But what might not be as apparent to outsiders is that they nearly all also function as memorials. There's essentially a behind every fountain. And these specific memorial fountains have a special name. The Armenian readers will already be able to tell you. They are pulpulaks, an onomatopoeic term for the sound of bubbling water. And they come in all shapes and sizes. Some of them are unmarked, some of them are marked, some of them are more elaborate and more explicitly memorials paired with a traditional Armenian stonework cross, a khachkar. Basically all sorts of shapes and sizes. Here are 3 examples here. The one in the middle, I had the sense it was supposed to be a fountain, but it was unusual among even that variety. And by chance, I happened to run into the owner, who explicitly mentioned that this is a memorial for some of the neighborhood children who had died because of the earthquake. So sometimes they are very subtle, and sometimes they are not. So while these fountains are not unique to Gyumri, the sheer scale of this mass death event in the 1980s gives their number and prevalence a special weight, regardless of their connection to the quake. So there is something about once there's a certain base number of memorial fountains around these pulpulaks, anything added on top immediately still has this extra association and a valence that they would not carry had they been located in Yerevan or some other place in Armenia. However, of those that do explicitly mention the quake, as there are here, they can be quite explicit. So either, as on the left, the date of the earthquake, You don't even need to read the rest of the inscription to know that that's exactly what they're talking about, or through specific visual themes and symbols. The clearest and most prevalent example of which is the clock. Clock stuck at 11:41. The time of this mid-morning quake has become an emblem of the earthquake. Famously, a public clock in Gyumri stopped at that moment, and images of that specific clock are all over publications about the earthquake, but really anything at that time, you immediately know this is a quake-related memorial. And this one on the right even appears to have a rendering of the ruins of Amenhotep Cathedral, the church in the city's main square. So not only do we have the time, we have memorials depicting ruin. So there's an interesting mix here of edifice and ruination in the same object, which I find very exciting. So at this moment, I'm just looking at a couple of individual fountains, but if I've spent the time walking through the city actually trying to measure and collect them, I think we also have to talk a little bit on grow, right? So taken individually, each bulbulak has its own story, but what I'm in the process of doing is trying to count and map each of them in this larger group and see what other information we can tease out there. Also, I can see at least one other cartographer in the room. In progress ideas get ugly graphics. That's just a rule. I don't make the rules. So here we have a little bit of a sketchy map of the city of Gyumri and its environs. Besides an obvious skew toward older neighborhoods, I've even in the upper left-hand side, or the northwest geographer. Northwest side of the screen, I've even cut off the newest neighborhoods, the 58th district and Mush, because the skew toward fountains happening in the older neighborhoods is so pronounced. And if we're talking about earthquake and ruin, we should talk about the places that actually ruined. But besides that skew, I would like to call attention to the relative evenness of fountains on main boulevards versus through smaller neighborhoods. Another interesting element of the diversity of these bulbulaks is where and how they occupy space. So they're either super public, so this bulbulak that says Spitak on it is literally in front of the main cinema in the main square. This is a public fountain, as opposed to these semi-private spaces. So this fountain is attached to the wall of someone's house. This is no longer public property. It's visible to the public. It's usable by the public, but it is clearly in someone else's space. And then there's even the kind of private that I literally don't have photos of because I've been trying really hard not to trespass while doing this. But by that, I mean in people's literal gardens and courtyards. You will occasionally also glimpse a small fountain. So this scale from very public to very private makes it harder to account for the way in which they operate, because they are these true vernacular memorials that are also a public service at the same time. And this sort of contradiction is one of the things that makes them such interesting artifacts. I would also say, again, returning specifically to the quake and this idea of landscape, it's important to impress upon you all that these aren't the permanent edifices which they appear. There's a liquid quality in a geological sense. And by that, I mean, there's still some sort of movement that is possible with the fountains themselves. So for example, fountains like the one on the left. This was built on the site of a fallen building, which is typically where post-earthquake fountains were built. Either the household of someone who died immediately outside, or in the case of the earthquake itself, sometimes on or right in front of the foundation of a massive apartment building that had just fallen. This particular one is in the area where there were several story buildings that just flattened. But this is an individual person who's memorialized here. And fountains like this one, they're still vulnerable to movement as the city develops, because the more you build next to rubble, the more, if you're hoping for it to stay forever, you're hoping for the rubble to never be rebuilt, and that's not anyone's hope here. So as streets get developed, as new buildings are built, some of these fountains edge a little closer to the street or edge a little farther in. And this is what I mean by the liquidity of movement. But there's still the sense that they should be tied to the place where someone died, which is not necessarily the case anymore. Drawing attention to the large khachkar on the right, there are two. I'm still counting this as a fountain, as there are two small water fountains in a basin. The importance of water in memorial rituals for Armenian culture is something that we have to take for granted in this exercise. But this is a fountain that's built at the very edge of the new neighborhood, the first new neighborhood built. So this is early 90s for people who lost their homes in the earthquake. And so rather than being tied to the place of death, instead this sort of memorial is following the mourners. So as one of the first actions of the community, it's what Gayana Shagoyan likened to some sort of act of consecration. And this is we are moving here because of this event, so we have to memorialize it in the people and the bodies we are leaving behind. So the fountains themselves are reacting to this rearrangement of space. The next object I'd like to talk about are containers, colloquially known as Domiks. So like little house, casita, essentially, which were the temporary shelters in which people were moved in the wake of the earthquake. So for the Americans, these are basically FEMA trailers, FEMA for 30 years. And famously, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the political turmoil that followed, the delay to recovery was such that even now there are still families living in these containers. And they are a popular, almost fetishistic object of foreign photojournalists who come to visit the city of Gyumri, that there are still people who are continuing to live there. And even if that number is dwindling, they remain a mark of shame on the city and their lack of recovery. The 30-year anniversary was literally referred to as the year of shame, and this is one of the physical emblems of that shame. But again, moving back to another quick map, on the subject of the fetishizing of these as an emblem of shame, I'd like to also say that there are these pockets of very specific neighborhoods that are known for Domiks. These are the ones that are very much covered and the ones that are objects of interest to people who are studying the wake of the earthquake. But as a researcher and as an outsider and as someone who's trying to take a broader view of things, these are also places I specifically did not go into as a solo researcher in this period. I'm trying to connect them better to times in which I'm interviewing people, so there's some sort of better invitation to enter them. So as we map everything, we see outside of them, the city is still replete with them. So it's more interesting to me that how many Domiks there are everywhere else. it's also worth mentioning that I'm drawing a line here between a humanitarian metric of how many people are living in bad conditions or in shelters that were meant to exist for 2 or 3 years at most. I'm instead more occupied with how these structures become repurposed in possibly more positive ways. So I'm really talking about the material here and less the living situation of people who have been there long term, which is a much more complicated story that we can talk about in the Q&A period if anyone's interested. But here I'm not just talking about a family living in the same emergency housing that they were provided with 32, 33 years ago, but rather all the other ways the material itself has been absorbed into the landscape of the city. So, for example, here this is a house made out of multiple domiks that have been used for as some kind of modular building material. But this is also interesting, given the way that the recovery operated. So the very existence of these are somewhat peculiar because of the major rehousing projects of the late 90s and early 2000s. So in what I am fairly confident was the largest post-Soviet rehousing program, from 2000 to 2004 was conducted by USAID through the Urban Institute and their partner organization, which still now exists locally as the Urban Foundation. So through housing vouchers, they rehoused something like 30,000 people. But the main goal wasn't just to rehouse people, but also to redevelop the city. And that required removing domiks. So the deal was for those receiving housing, it was through vouchers. And a condition of receiving a housing voucher was to turn over the domik itself to be destroyed. The very fact that there isn't an elephant graveyard of half-destroyed domiks represents some kind of resistance to this kind of erasure. Again, nothing gets erased, things just get buried. And they get buried in different ways. So these increasingly misnamed temporary shelters are subject to all sorts of improvisation. I'm showing you on the left a half bricked over domik. Once you get an eye for it, you can often see small brick extensions to other people's houses that just by the dimensions, it's very clear it was a domik. Someone bricked over it, re-insulated it, and now it's a slightly larger than a domik sized extension to a house. All sorts of different creative ways in which they were reintegrated. And among these kinds of improvisations, there are also definitely haves and have-nots. So what in the US would look like a cute ranch house on the right is actually 2 finished-made domiks connected with brick panels to make a triple wide house of a much different condition than the one that you see on the left. This also acts as a different kind of memorialization. So as I mentioned previously, a lot of this research has been an act of training the eye. So I can, for example, look at this gate to a multi-story private home, and from a mile away, I can say that that middle panel, that green panel with the white stripe, came from a Soviet Union distributed dormitory trailer. No question. And here, the absorption into the landscape is not just one of necessity, but also one of nostalgia. So they're creating its own memory. The owner of the house even mentioned, yeah, we lived in a domik, then we built a house. We kind of wanted to remember where we came from. Here's the panel, here's the wall. Sometimes it's intentional, sometimes it's an implicit memory because you're still cannibalizing the materials out of necessity. And both of those things can work together in the same house, in the same world. Now, finally, rather than talking about large classes of objects, I just have 2 small, what I'm currently referring to as multiple memorials that I'd like to talk a little bit about because I think they they also illustrate the point nicely. This is a khachkar with a fountain, a lovely little park. It's quite a large, specifically elaborate memorial, quite new. I think the date on it is 2011. But if you read the inscription on the foundation of the cross, it says it's a memorial dedicated to the victims of the Great Earthquake and Artsakh. Artsakh being the Armenian word for Nagorno-Karabakh. And to mention the earthquake and Artsakh in the same breath is not completely out of line. For reference, in 1988 was a year of pogroms and political movements and myriad tragedy on top of the quake. But the ambiguity of just saying Artsakh is a little bit troubling. We're not talking about the Karabakh movement necessarily. Are we talking about the war? It's 2011, which is an odd time. What is being memorialized specifically by just naming a place is we can guess, but we can't know, and that's surprising. But much like memory as a cognitive process, here in this monument, traumatic events are being conflated and compressed into a single edifice, into a single larger feeling. And from there, I think it's interesting to contrast to one of my favorite memorials in the city, which isn't for the quake. This is a memorial to workers of the local sock factory who died in World War II. But if you notice the difference between the age and style between the statue itself and its accompanying engravings, the memorial was reset long after the quake. So the statue was more or less in place originally, then it was in a park somewhere for some years, then it got reorganized with some more contextual engravings. And there's a literal parenthetical in the inscription that says damaged by the 1988 earthquake, which it feels by way of apology. Like, we didn't neglect this grave, other forces intervened. So now the event of the earthquake is not only reaching forward in time as we see it today, because we are people walking around the city seeing monuments to the past, but also somehow backward in time, recontextualizing how we remember the past. So without an intention, this aside has made this monument to people who died in World War II also, in a way, a memorial to the quake. So sometimes these strata, these layers of memory, are able to collapse or interweave. And all that said, it's hard to speak about a major trauma in Armenia, and I feel myself using the word trauma again and again in this talk. It's difficult to talk about that without acknowledging that this past year has also been subject to multiple traumas and multiple catastrophes. And being here and witnessing this and thinking about my own research, it's hard not to think about all the physical marks in the city that those catastrophes are leaving and wonder which ones will remain. So I often think about the longevity of the coffins that occupied people's minds when talking about the quake. So early accounts about the earthquake into the 90s, the presence of coffins on the street come up all the time. It became a feature of the city. And I think about those and how long, for example, the piles of tires on the street last summer will occupy our minds in the future. Or in the same way that schools and tents were a big part of Gyumri childhood for a generation, how long will, for example, the paint on the ground remind us of COVID, and how long before it's painted over? So when we talk about edifice and we talk about the monument and memorialization, even the things that I've been showing that are literally set in stone they are, there's still a snapshot in time of what the physical memory of the city is. And 5 years ago, it was different, and in 5 years, it will be different again. It's very frustrating to stay doing research longer than you intended because the world keeps changing around you, and the same applies for the landscape itself. So to close, I'm looking at these traces because I want to think more about the way the landscape holds knowledge and holds knowledge that we take for granted. So by zooming in on the past, I'm not trying to deny a traumatized city the right to forget and move on, but rather try to widen our view a bit and maybe valorize what traces we've allowed to remain. So I would talk for an hour just on this picture. I don't know what you guys, what kinds of questions you guys have, but I'm excited to hear all of them. It's still surprisingly early in the project for this particular component. So I'm excited to hear your questions, and thank you everyone for listening.